Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And I hope everybody out there had a big week, a good week. Not just a big week, but a good week. And I hope you're pumped for the weekend, right? I'm pumped. I'm super pumped. I'm going to be doing yard work, specifically a lot of weeding, and that means I am stoked to do that weeding because I absolutely love weeding. Anyway, that's not true at all. That's a complete lie. I hate weeding. I am dreading the rest of this day, but I'll listen to something really good, and that will make weeding not so bad. Anyway, on the show this week, let's get to that. At the end, we're going to be talking about different finishes when it comes to paint. We don't always think about our finish when we're choosing paint colors and all of that. We're really focused, hyper-focused on the color. We don't think about finish so much. Or if we do think about finish, it's usually, I would say really, you can't say 100% of the time, but 80% of the time or more, it's generally, if we're thinking about finish, it's about the practical aspect of what finish is going to do for us. It's durability or hiding imperfections or something like that. We don't think about finish as a design tool. And that's what we're going to talk about at the end of the show. Finish as a design tool. We'll also be talking about Art Deco one more time. Last week I dug into its history and its origins. This time I want to be more practical and talk about how and why to bring some Art Deco flair into your own home. We'll talk about colors and materials and finishes that will help you do that. And we'll make sure that you don't create a space that just screams Art Deco. So that's all coming up. But right now, I want to get back to stinks and smells. You know, if you remember last week, I mentioned that my son bought a house, and one of the first things he encountered was this seriously, problematically horrible, I don't even think that's the right way to say it. There are no words to describe how horrible and powerful this smell was that we encountered in his entry. And because of that, I told you last week that we're going to kind of do a series that will continue throughout the summer a little bit. Just from time to time, we'll talk about different common smells that you might run into in a home and how to deal with them. So smoke smells and things like that. And last week, we just talked about the difference between covering over and masking a smell versus eliminating. We talked about some tools to use to eliminate smells. Now I want to get practical, and I want to talk about specifically the horrible smell Caleb was dealing with. He had a squirrel living in the attic above this little entryway that I was talking about, and he was working with a pest company to get it out. And we assumed that the stink was from the squirrel nest, and all the mess that the squirrel had made up in the attic. But the smell was so profound that after a couple of visits, I knew it wasn't just squirrel mess. I'm not an expert, but it was dead. Something was dead. And we thought the squirrel had been, allowed out of the house and couldn't get back in. So unless there were other squirrels in there, that was a horrible thought, that they were trapped in there and they died. But it was a dead thing. It wasn't just squirrel mess. Well, good news is nothing to do with the squirrel. He ripped all of that ceiling out, and a lot of squirrel mess up there, but no dead squirrels. And he was convinced that was the source of the stink. But after about 10 minutes of having that out of there and realizing the stink is just as pervasive, he knew there was something else going on. Well, anyway, it turns out, long story short, he had to rip up the floor in that little entry, and there was a dead possum, underneath the space. And it had been there for several weeks, and it was bad. In fact, it was so bad that I just quit visiting for a while. Now, if you've ever been and at that point in your own home, facing a dead animal stink and not sure how to go about eradicating it, I've got the info you need. But before we start talking about dealing with the stink, let's talk briefly about the stink itself. What determines how bad it is and what determines how long it lasts. Well, of course, the size of the animal plays a big role here. The bigger it is, the more potential for stink. That's not rocket science. Other factors include the temperature, the humidity, and how much airflow reaches the area. Warm and damp, it's the absolute worst combination. Cool and dry, that's the least bad. It's not great, but it's least bad. My kid's problem, this came about, or it didn't come about because of this, but the possum died over the winter, and it was nicely kept frozen, wonderfully frozen, non-smelly frozen all winter long. But then the warm-up happened, and oh my goodness, warm and damp, it really kicked in, and the stink became almost like a member of the family. Now, if you're looking for practical timelines, because I asked, how bad does a stink get and how long do stinks last? If you're looking for that, there is some idea. If it's a single mouse, it might smell for a few days to a week. You're to deal with it, but you can get through it. A rat or a squirrel, you're looking at a couple weeks. A possum, a raccoon, anything larger than that, you could be dealing with several weeks. In some cases, pest control people say it can last up to 2 months or longer for a larger animal in a damp enclosed space. So just be aware. Size of the animal is going to determine, of course, how long that stink can go. Now, for me, here's how I work with things like this. This is just open insight, honest insight into me, into how my brain works. When I'm facing something like this for a few days or a few weeks, I almost always start to wonder, is this it? Is this the big one? Is this the one that never, ever goes away? Am I going to have to try to sell the house? Is this smell permanent? Is my house ever going to be normal ever again? All of that goes through my brain, and the panic machine starts up and really gets moving. Now, if your brain sometimes goes there too, there's good news. It's not permanent. Your house will smell normal again. But how long that takes and what you need to do to get there all depends on the situation. Let's talk about everything you need to know to locate the source and eradicate the smell of a dead animal from your home. And let's do that right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. People often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And we're talking about how to remove the smell of a dead animal in your home. It could be a mouse, it could be a rat, it could be a squirrel, it could be a possum, like my kid was just dealing with. Whatever it is, if you encounter that kind of smell and you're living with it over the course of even just a few days, it really does start to mess with you. You can start to feel, if you're anything like me, you can start to feel like this whole thing could be, permanent. You may worry that the house is going to permanently absorb that smell. Well, the good news is you can get rid of it completely. Let's talk about it and how you do that. Now, the first thing you need to do, of course, in order to eradicate it is you've got to find the source of the stink and remove it. And unfortunately, the primary tool that you've got in your toolbox for this is going to be your nose. So walk slowly, close doors to isolate rooms, and pay attention to where the smell intensifies. Check near outlets, baseboards, vents, attic latches, crawl space doors, understairs. Become one with the stink. That's what you're trying to do here. Think like the stink, track the stink. And as you're doing this, there is a misconception that's worth correcting. People often assume that the animal is inside the ductwork because the smell seems to come from the vents. But pest control pros say that that's rarely the case. The HVAC system usually ends up just moving the odor around the house. The animal is usually going to be in a wall or attic space near a duct run, but not inside the duct itself. So use your nose, use your pet's noses as well. If you've got pets, dog or a cat obsessively sniffing one particular wall, cabinet, or vent, that's a clue worth following. Another critter that can help you find it are blowflies. Are you familiar with these? Hopefully not. Hopefully not, because if you're seeing large metallic-looking flies congregating in one area of your house, follow them. It's like the instructions right out of Harry Potter. Follow the spiders. Except in this instance, it's follow the blowflies. Blowflies appearing indoors often indicate that there's a dead animal or something in the wall or in the attic, and they can lead you to the source. Now, when you find the source, you don't need to celebrate for too long. Don't overdo it. Right away, you want to get it out of there. So wear gloves, wear a mask, especially in enclosed spaces like a crawl space or an attic. And before you start working and moving in there, get the air moving. So open windows, run a fan. You want fresh air pulling through that space the entire time you're working, and you'll keep it going after you're done. Now, one safety point that I should focus on before we move on. If you find rodent droppings or nesting material near the carcass, don't just sweep them up. Don't vacuum them up. That stirs particles into the air, and that can spread disease. So instead, spray the droppings with a disinfectant or a 1 to 10 bleach and water solution. Let it soak, probably 5-10 minutes or so, and then wipe everything up with paper towels. of course, throw the paper towels away and then mop or sponge the area with disinfectant again. For the carcass, you're going to want to double bag it and then dispose of it properly according to local rules. So look into that. If the animal was on a hard, non-porous surface, concrete, metal, vinyl, things like that, when you remove it and clean the area promptly, the smell is usually going to go away pretty quickly once you start ventilating. You're in good shape. Best case scenario there. If decomposition fluids have soaked into porous materials like insulation, carpet pad, unfinished wood, drywall, ceiling tile, if that happens, you've got a different situation. Those materials absorb those fluids, and when that happens, the smell can linger way past the point where the carcass itself has dried out. This is wonderful talk on a morning. As you're crunching your Cheerios, we're talking about carcasses drying out. But if those fluids penetrate those porous areas, those smells can linger. It can even seem to come back, way down the road on humid days. In those cases, when you find that it's soaked into materials, the fix is removing the contaminated material and then cleaning that area with a disinfectant. All right, so remove the material, clean the area, and then once it's clean and dry, you're going to want to apply an enzymatic cleaner to break down any remaining organic residue. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about when I say an enzymatic cleaner, we talked about them last week. Basically, these cleaners use enzymes to digest the biological material at a molecular level, and they keep working way after you applied them. That's different than normal cleaners. It's going to keep working. And this is the step that eliminates lingering odor rather than covering it over. You can find these cleaners at pretty much any pet store. Look for Nature's Miracle. That's one brand, or something similar. So you're going to want that, an enzymatic cleaner. Once you've got the contaminated material out, once you've got the area clean and dry, you may want to take extra precautions. That depends on the situation and if the situation allows it. But if that's the case and you're still worried about a persistent smell, you can seal any hard surfaces with an odor-blocking primer. We talked about that last week as well. Shellac-based primers like Bin are the strongest option for this. Just remember, the primer is the final lock, the final step on a problem that's already been solved. It's not step one. So make sure you clean everything, disinfect, hit it with that enzymatic cleaner before you get to the primer step. Now, if you can't locate or access the source, maybe it's in a wall cavity or between floors, something like that. If that happens, what in the world do you do? Well, the honest answer is that the intense smell, that horrible, horrible smell, is eventually going to fade on its own as the carcass dries out. For a mouse, it's usually going to take a week or so, like we talked about. For something larger, it could be a month or more. But here's the caveat, and this connects to what we just got done talking about. If the fluids, the decomposition fluids, have drained into insulation or drywall inside that area, that wall pocket or whatever, if that happens, you're going to notice a smell that lingers or comes back on humid days, even after the worst has passed. If that's happening weeks later, you're probably looking at having to open up that wall to remove the contaminated material. I know it's not fun, but that's the way to get it solved and to really be able to move on. Now, in the meantime, if you're trying to wait it out, there are a couple of tools that can help you manage the smell while nature runs its course. First off, activated charcoal bags. We talked about them last week. Activated charcoal works by physically trapping odor molecules in millions of tiny pores. You're not adding a scent, you're pulling the stink out of the air. So place them as close as you can to the affected area. You can find them pretty much at a ton of different stores. And they're usually around $10 to $15 or so for a multi-pack. You can set them in the sun every couple of weeks to recharge them. So charcoal packs, that's one way to go. Second, foaming enzymatic cleaners. Now, these are designed for exactly this kind of situation. You drill a small hole in the wall cavity, inject the foam, and then the enzymes go to work digesting that organic material from inside. Products like Bacazap, BAC-A-Zap, they make a foaming version specifically for wall voids and enclosed spaces. You can find them online or through pest control suppliers, so look into that. Charcoal bags, they handle what's in the air. The enzymatic foam is going to attack the source inside the wall. Use them together, and that's your best combination short of opening up the wall. But I want to be straight with you. These are management tools. They're really not going to be magic. If fluids have soaked into porous materials, these things will help, but they may not fully solve it. You might just be buying some time. All right. I've got a few random thoughts as we wrap this part up and before we take a look at prevention. First, random thought. As you're trying to find and deal with a smell, keep in mind that a dead animal smell is not always a dead animal. Propane and natural gas are odorless, so a chemical odorant is added to them. We all know that. And most of us describe that smell as rotten egg smell. But some people experience it more like a skunk spray or like a decay smell. So if you can't find the source, the smell isn't fading, or it's got a sharp chemical edge, don't just keep masking it or assuming it's going to go away. Leave the area, call your gas company to check the lines. Just be sure that it's not something bigger going on. Second, random thought, and this one matters because it can directly create the exact problem we've been talking about. You may have heard that certain rodent poisons will make mice or rats go outside looking for water before they die. Or maybe you've heard another version of it, that the poison dries them out. Then maybe they stay in the house, but it dries them out so they don't smell at all. It's one of these things that gets repeated so often, it starts to sound like common knowledge. But from everything I've seen in digging into the research for this particular segment, everything I've seen says that's basically a myth. Pest control experts, even the manufacturers of poisons, say there's really not a rodent poison out there that's magically going to send the critter outdoors in search of water, or that's going to dry the body out so that it doesn't stink. What actually happens, it's much simpler, much more frustrating. The rodent's going to eat the bait, it's going to get sick over the next several days, and then it's going to die. It's going to croak wherever it happens to be. And a lot of the time, that means its nest, inside a wall, under insulation, behind an appliance, probably somewhere you absolutely don't want it to die. And that's why so many pest professionals recommend snap traps instead of poison inside the house. That's one of the reasons. Poison in the house, just not having poison in the house is one of the reasons they recommend snap traps. But snap traps allow you to be able to, you know where the critter is. When the trap goes off and you catch the mouse or the rat or whatever, oh, please, let it never be a rat in my house. I don't know that I'd be able to handle that. So I'm going to just think about mice. If I catch the mouse in a trap, I know where he is. I just got to get the trap out, clean the area, clean everything off, and I'm good to go. With a poison, you have no idea exactly where the critter went until the stink starts. All right? So think about snap traps. Realize that whole poison thing is potentially a myth. It seems to be a myth. It's not going to dry them out, not going to make them leave the house searching for water. Keep that in mind. All right, last thing I've got on this particular topic is preventing this from happening again. Once the smell is gone, or even as you're working on the smell, you've got to ask yourself the question, how did the critter get in the first place? So go around and look for gaps and holes around your home and seal them. For small openings, skip the ordinary foam and caulk only approach you read about online. A lot of places recommend that. A lot of websites and blogs will say just seal it that way. But rodents can chew right through all of that. So pack the gap first with copper mesh or stainless steel mesh. It's not going to corrode or rust or anything like that. And then seal it over with a good exterior grade caulk or a pest blocking foam. For bigger openings, move up to hardware cloth, metal flashing, or other solid chew-resistant materials. And don't forget the obvious entry points: chimney caps, vent screens, damaged soffits, loose siding, gaps around pipes or utility lines. Check all of that stuff. Also, go in your garage, turn off the lights and close the door. If you see light coming in around the closed door and it's as big as a dime, that's an entry point for mice. So work to seal that as well. All right, the goal is to make sure you've never got to deal with this again, so make sure you look into that prevention stuff. All right, that's enough of that. When we come back, we're going to be looking at Art Deco and how to apply it in our own homes without turning them into set pieces from the 1920s. That's all coming up right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. Welcome back. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And last week we talked about Art Deco, where it came from, what made it so distinctive, and why it made such a splash in the 1920s and the 1930s. Basically, we covered the history of it, the origins of it. Today, I want to shift into the practical side of this for homeowners, for everybody out there listening, because this is where it really gets fun. I like the history stuff, but the practical stuff, Well, of course, it's practical. This is what you can actually use. So how does Art Deco still shape interiors today? And maybe more importantly than that question, how can you use it in a real house? In my house, without making the space feel, ridiculous or, like it's trying to be a 1920s movie set. Because that's really the challenge with historical styles. It's one thing to admire them and to really enjoy what they're doing. It's another thing to bring them into your home and to bring them in successfully, so it doesn't look like you're trying to do something unusual with the space. You want it to flow and to feel like it's part of the home, not just this add-on thing pasted on top of it, not like a costume or anything like that. So how do you do that with Art Deco? Well, the good news is that Art Deco really is one of those styles that translates surprisingly well into modern decorating, especially if you borrow selectively. You don't have to recreate a full-on Art Deco interior to get the benefits of the look. In fact, for most people, that's going to be way too much. But you can absolutely take some of the core principles and then use them to give a room more elegance, more confidence, more visual impact. So that's what we're going to talk about. And let's start with the basic ingredients. If you want a room to feel Art Deco inspired, the first thing to think about is shape. Art Deco loves geometry. It loves clear lines. It loves repeated patterns. That might mean a mirror with a stepped frame. It could mean wallpaper with a fan pattern or a geometric motif or something like that. It could mean a rug with a bold linear structure. It could mean a light fixture that uses globes, metal, symmetry. It could be a vanity with fluted details or a cabinet, with curved corners and brass pulls, things like that. A lot of different things. It's not a casual style. That's the main thing to remember. It likes structure. It likes shape. So think about shape. The second ingredient is contrast. Art Deco tends to work best when there's some kind of tension in the room. Light against dark, gloss against matte, soft upholstery against hard metal, cream walls against black trim, deep, jewel tones against warm metallic finishes. It likes that push and pull. It likes the definition that it creates. The third ingredient that you want to remember is sheen. And this is a huge one. And we briefly just mentioned it when we talked about contrast, gloss and matte. But sheen is something that we should always be thinking about with any paint project that we tackle. We talk about color all the time, but the finish, the sheen, quite often is an afterthought. Well, Art Deco has always had this incredible affinity for, that's probably the best way to say it, an affinity for surfaces that reflect light. So lacquer, glossy, highly polished lacquer, mirrored materials, polished metal, glass, smooth stone, sleek tile. Art Deco loves those things. So even if your paint color in that space is really quiet and reserved, if you bump up the sheen, that can make a dramatic statement and push the room toward an Art Deco feel without really going into any kind of, maybe bolder or more daring color schemes. All right, so those are three ingredients to keep in mind. Now let's get more specific when it comes to color. Let's dive into that a little deeper here. A lot of people assume that Art Deco always is going to mean black and gold. And yeah, that's certainly one version of Art Deco. That's a color scheme that we see a lot: black, ivory, brass, and chrome. They absolutely create a striking Art Deco palette. But the style is actually way broader than that. Art Deco will work with rich jewel tones, emerald green, sapphire blue, deep teal, burgundy, plum. It can also use blush pinks, dusty roses, pale aquas, warm cream, smoky taupe, elegant grays, all of those tones as well. Some palettes are dramatic and moody, others are soft and refined. What matters most is that the color choices feel deliberate and usually somewhat elevated. Art Deco isn't a style that tends to thrive on, kind of random muddiness. Even when the colors are muted, there's usually something polished about the way they're used. They didn't just fall together. They were purposely chosen and intentionally placed together. So let's say you want to, because I know that's kind of vague. It's vague as I say it. I get it. It's vague when you hear it. Let's get even more practical. Let's get, really dial it in. Let's say you want to bring some Art Deco into a room and you want to do that with your paint colors. Well, one approach would be a dramatic wall color. So a deep green in a dining room, a rich navy in a bedroom, a charcoal in a powder room. Those kinds of colors can feel very Art Deco, especially when you pair them with things like we talked about earlier, brass lighting, crisp trim, remember the contrast, maybe a mirror or a graphic wallpaper. Another approach would be a soft, elegant backdrop. Rather than going with a dramatic wall color, go with something soft and elegant. Maybe a warm cream, a pale blush, maybe a light gray-green on the walls. And then you bring in the Art Deco energy through black accents, metallic fixtures, geometric shapes, and strong furniture lines. And that's probably the smartest route for many of us. Let the paint create the atmosphere, a softer, more reserved atmosphere, but then let the accessories and the architecture carry more of the explicit style of Art Deco. Because here's the thing, Art Deco can become overwhelming if every single element is, shouting at you. If the wallpaper is dramatic, if the lighting's dramatic, if you brought in a mirror and that's dramatic, if the paint colors are dramatic, if the tile you've got is dramatic, if all of that's really dramatic, then pretty soon the whole room feels, way less elegant, and it just feels exhausting. Art Deco is going to work best when it's a little bit reserved. Let it make a statement, that's what you want, but you don't want it to make 10 statements at once. So, maybe the way to go, if you're just starting out for sure with trying to dabble in this style, go that route of having a more, reserved wall color and bring in the style with accessories and architecture and stuff like that. Also, if you love Art Deco, you don't need a whole house kind of commitment to it. In fact, some of the best places to use the Art Deco influence are small, high-impact spaces. So powder rooms, they're great for this. You can go darker, you can go glossier. You can just have more fun in a littler space like that. A jewel-toned wall, a brass sconce, a bold mirror, a black vanity, maybe some geometric tile. All of that can really work, and lean towards, that Art Deco kind of a style. It can give a nod towards Art Deco, and it can be really fun in that one little enclosed space. Just don't overdo it, like we talked about. Make a statement, but not 10 statements. But you don't have to do it through the whole home. One room, like a powder room, great place to do it. Entryways, that's another really good choice to try this style. Art Deco is really good at making a first impression. A strong console, a sunburst mirror, a crisp wall color, all of that can make an entrance feel more intentional. You're not necessarily blasting Art Deco style through the room. You're just taking elements of it and using that in the entryway. It's perfect for a space like that. Dining rooms, it works really well there too because Art Deco has a natural connection to entertaining. If you remember last week, its origins were all about, the nightlife and just the excitement of the 20s, and that just lends itself to the idea of entertaining, which is exactly what dining rooms, generally speaking, are meant for. If you want a dining room to feel a little more special, a little more energized, a little more elevated, Art Deco has a lot to offer. So think about that in a space like that. It can also work really well in bedrooms, especially if you lean into upholstered shapes, symmetry and calmer versions of what the Art Deco color palettes have to offer. Maybe not a full black lacquer, look all over the place, unless that's really your thing, but a softer Art Deco, maybe dusty rose, muted greens, the warm ivory, those kinds of colors. So those are some rooms you can look at. And then, of course, there are all kinds of individual things, different items, different pieces you can bring in that will nod towards the style. A single Art Deco style mirror, different light fixtures that mimic the style or nod towards the style, a cabinet that leans in that direction, a wallpapered nook, a vanity area. Sometimes that's all it takes, just a little thing to give your home just that little extra bit of interest. All right, before we wrap this up, let's make this as practical as I can make it. If you want to try an Art Deco inspired look, just start with one room. One room in the home. It doesn't need to be a big room. It could be a powder room like we just talked about. Start with one room and ask yourself 3 questions. First off, do I want this room to feel dramatic or elegant? If the answer to that question is dramatic, then you're going to want to lean darker and richer with your colors. So deep greens, navies, charcoal colors, black accents, metallic finishes. Let the room have some weight. That's what you want to do if you want to go towards a more dramatic feel. If the answer is elegant, you're going to want to lean lighter and softer with your colors. So cream, pale blush, taupes, muted blue-greens, soft grays, colors like that. Then let the accessories and other details do the bulk of the work. All right, that's the first question. Second question to ask yourself is, where's the geometry going to come from? Because if you remember, that's a big part of Art Deco is the shape, the geometric patterns and things like that. Where is the geometry going to come from in your space? Is it going to come from the wallpaper, from the mirror, from a light fixture? Is it going to come from the tile, from the rug? Pick one or two places, one, maybe two places. Not every place. Art Deco is going to work best when the pattern feels intentional, not when the room is shouting, from every corner. We talked about that earlier. Less is more in this regard. Third question that you want to ask yourself is, where is the shine going to come from? Is it going to be brass? Is it going to be chrome? Is it going to be glass? Is it going to be a satin finish or even a shinier finish on the walls? A glossy vanity, mirrored furniture? Where is the shine going to come from? And again, choose strategically, because a little bit of shine is going to go a long, long way. Too much, and the room can start to feel like a hotel lobby or a stage set or something like that. Just a little bit of intentional, placement of this increased sheen, this gloss, whether it's on the walls or wherever. So those three questions, if you answer them, you're already thinking in the language of Art Deco. You're not just asking, what can I buy? You're asking, where should the emphasis go? You're deciding where the drama belongs, where the structure comes from, and where the polish is going to show up. And that may be the biggest lesson of Art Deco, for all of us. It's not really about piling on all kinds of things, expensive things or deeply, richly colored things. It's about composition. It's about knowing what to emphasize and what to leave alone. It's about using line and color and contrast and finish to create a sense of polish and intentionality. And that makes it surprisingly accessible. You don't need a historic house or some amazing, hotel-like, movie palace-like lobby to work in. You can do this in your own space, in your own home. You just need to understand the language of the style. Like we said, the geometry, the contrast, the elegance, and the confidence of it. Understand the language of the style, and you can apply it in a way that will fit into any space in your home. And maybe there's a larger lesson here as we wrap all of this up. Once you understand the language of Art Deco, you start to realize that every single design style out there has a language of its own. The arts and crafts movement has a language. Mid-century modern has a language. The Victorian style has a language. Scandinavian design has a language. They all have a language. Each style has certain colors and shapes and materials and finishes and ideas that make it feel, like itself. And once you learn to look for those things, you can borrow from a style more intentionally. You're not just copying a room from a magazine at that point. And it's way more exciting. You're asking way better questions. You're asking, what gives this style its character? Where does the emphasis go when I'm working in this style? What should be repeated? What should be restrained? That's what makes design more approachable for everybody. You don't have to recreate a style perfectly. You just have to understand enough of its language to speak it clearly in your own home. That's the goal, and that's a really exciting place to land. So Art Deco, thank you for tolerating my great big long deep dive into it. I had so much fun learning about it. Hopefully you pick something up that you can apply too. All right, let's shift gears slightly and talk about something that we don't always think about when we're picking paint, the finish. We'll get to that right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by RepcoLite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. Welcome back. You're listening to Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And last segment, I said something about Art Deco that I want to circle back to. But hold on, don't freak out. This is not going to be about Art Deco. It's got a much broader application. We spend a lot of time, when you think about it, we spend a lot of time talking and thinking about paint colors. And that makes sense, right? Because color's the first thing you notice. It's the thing that people agonize over when they're making, some renovations or making a change to a space in their home. They agonize over the color. But there's another paint decision that doesn't get nearly as much attention, and it really should. And that's the finish, the sheen, the amount of shine in the paint. And it's important because sheen changes everything. The same color can feel soft and quiet in a matte. It can feel clean and practical in an eggshell. It can feel polished in a satin. It can feel dramatic in a high gloss. Same color, different finish, and you get a completely different feeling room depending on the sheen. And the reason that happens is because of light. A flat or a matte paint absorbs light. It doesn't bounce much back at you. So the color reads deeper, softer, calmer, and it also hides a lot of imperfections. And that's why flat is so popular on ceilings. A shinier finish, it's going to reflect light, and that's going to make a color feel brighter and richer and more energized. It's going to make a surface feel more formal, more dressed up, but it's also going to show more brush strokes, more roller marks, more drywall flaws, and other imperfections. So sheen plays two roles, basically. But usually, if we think about sheen at all, we only think about it from the practical point of view, about durability and hiding imperfections. But there's a second role that sheen plays. It's also a design tool, and most people have no idea how much you can do with it. Here are just a few examples. 1, try painting your walls and trim the exact same color, but step the trim up a sheen or two. So if the wall is matte, put satin sheen or something like that on the trim. If the wall's eggshell, try a semi-gloss on the trim. You haven't changed the color at all in that situation, but the architecture, that trim is going to quietly emerge. The trim's going to catch more light. The room's going to look way more considered, way more custom, a little more formal, a little more elegant. It's going to give you that contrast without adding a color. And that's why it's going to feel more elegant than just having white trim or something like that with that contrast. You can also use sheen to control attention. And what I mean is this: you keep the walls soft and quiet, let's say matte finish, something like that, and then let a satin bookcase, a painted door, or a glossy piece of furniture become the feature. It's a way to add interest without adding more pattern or more clutter or even another color. You could do this all in the same color, but the different finish is going to tell your eye where to look. It's a really interesting trick to try. Another thing you could do is take a small room, maybe a powder room, let's say, paint it a deep saturated color, an emerald, a navy, something like that, and paint it in a semi-gloss or a high gloss. The whole room, when you do that, is going to become a jewel box. Light is going to bounce off every surface. The color stops being color and it starts being almost a material. You walk in and you feel like you stepped into something. Now, another thing that we see all over the place is glossy ceilings. It's one of the great underused tricks in design. We're so used to flat white ceilings that we forget the ceiling is a fifth wall. Paint it in a high sheen finish, even if it's just white, and it's going to reflect the room back at itself. It bounces light, and it can make a low ceiling feel taller and a small room feel bigger. Designers use this in dining rooms, entryways, small studies, powder rooms all the time. But before you rush off to the store, even to paint your entire powder room, the walls a glossy color, I do need to mention that a glossy ceiling and glossy walls, they can be a little bit of a struggle too, but glossy ceilings are probably one of the hardest paint jobs in a house to pull off. I want to be really clear about that. A ceiling gets raking light. Light comes in through windows at low angles. It comes from overhead fixtures, and all of it skims across the ceiling instead of hitting it straight on. Flat paint hides a lot of that. Gloss paint is going to broadcast it. Every drywall seam, every tape joint, every screw pop, every roller mark, every brush mark, every speck of dust. Gloss is going to find them and put a spotlight on every one. Now, most drywall in most homes isn't finished well enough for that. It's finished well enough for flat paint, matte paint, things like that. But glossy paint, it's a whole different animal. And without the level of prep that you need, the skim coating, the sanding, the priming, sanding again before you even open the finish coat, without that level of prep, every imperfection is likely going to show up the moment the ceiling catches light. So be aware with the glossy finishes that you see, when people go to full gloss, that's a can of worms that you're opening up there. You might want to get a professional, and you might want to get somebody who's done this before. You don't just might want to. You want to get somebody who's done this before, and you want to see some pictures of some rooms that they've done. If you want to try, a taste of what a reflective ceiling can do without going to full gloss, maybe try a satin sheen or something like that. But even then, it is a little more of a struggle on a ceiling to make that look good than just using a flat. Anyway, don't forget about finish and about sheen when it comes to pulling a room together. It's a conversation you should be having and something you should be thinking about. There's a lot you can do with it. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to catch it again, you can find it online at RepcoLite.com. Just click the On the Radio tab on the homepage. And whatever you do today, make sure paint's a part of it. Have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll see you next week. For Home in Progress by RepcoLite Paints, I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.